Welcome to the Tri-State Autism Spectrum Disorder webinar series. The topic of this training is how to implement a Circle of Friends group for students who have autism. This is part one in a two-part webinar series. My name is Mary Schlueter. I'm a special education teacher. I've been a teacher, I think, at just about every age and grade level that there can be. I started off in early childhood special needs. I taught general education second grade for a while, and then I jumped back into special education. That's really where my heart has always been. I've done elementary, middle, and high school levels. I am currently a high school special ed teacher in a full inclusion program. The kids I get on my caseload tend to have diagnoses like autism, behavior disorders, other mental health diagnoses, learning disabilities, physical impairments, hearing impairments. It's really kind of a mixed bag. I'm also an adjunct professor at several different university programs. The focus of the courses that I usually teach have to do with behavioral interventions that will help students successfully stay in the regular classroom setting. There are several objectives for this webinar. In the first part, we're going to explore the program background and evidence-based for Circle of Friends. We're going to learn group implementation basics, and we'll also be comparing different Circle of Friends models that you'll be able to choose from. In the second webinar, we'll be working on gaining implementation ideas for meeting topics and activities so that you know exactly what to do at your meetings. We will explore obstacles and possible solutions based on things that we have seen in other groups across the state for a number of years. And we will also be learning next steps. There are additional layers of support for your groups that we'll be sharing with you. I'd like to begin by sharing some background information about how Circle of Friends developed across our state, and I'll start by sharing a personal story. I think it's important to understand the whys, why we are doing Circle of Friends groups, and this story will illustrate that. It's a personal story. I was 14 years old when my cousin, I will call him Joe, was born. I had a brother born about the same time, so they grew up together. There was a lot of back and forth between our houses, and I was able to observe Joe. And I noticed that there were some things that were unique about him. First of all, he didn't develop language for a late. He was a late language acquisition person. But when he did start to talk, he was speaking immediately in full sentences. He would go on and on in his area of special interest, which was whales. He loved marine biology, but he would go on and on to anybody that would listen about the habitat of different kinds of whales, the anatomy of whales, what they ate, where they swam, saving the oceans, all those kinds of things. He was very, very much into that. And it was cute, and he sounded smart, but there were some things that were really concerning to his mom, my aunt. For one, he was very fixated on certain things. He would only eat certain numbers of foods, not a very big variety. He would have meltdowns when he was 4 and 5 years old that really weren't typical of children that age. When they left the park because it was time to go home, that could result in a 2 or 3 hour meltdown. And by the time he approached school age, she was very concerned because she had tried to arrange some play dates, but he was very bossy with other kids, would really more play next to them by himself. But there wasn't a whole lot of interaction. So when it was time for kindergarten, when they did the pre-kindergarten evaluations that they do with students, my aunt went to them and said, I think that there's something different and I would like a more full evaluation for him. And because he was so academically gifted, they said, nope, he's fine. They challenged her parenting and thought maybe she should take some parenting classes, and maybe he was spoiled and that's why he was having some of these behaviors. Well, needless to say, my aunt wasn't happy, but there was really not much that she could do about it. So Joe started school. He did fine with academics. There really weren't too many gaps there, but he absolutely struggled when it came to social skills and interacting with other students. My aunt kept asking for help. The school kept saying no until 4th grade. They finally gave him an IEP, diagnosing him as a student with a learning disability in written expression, not because he couldn't formulate really advanced complex sentences. He could, but his fine motor skills were a little bit low for his age. So I think just to get my aunt off their back, they gave him that diagnosis and he finally got an IEP. As fate would have it, I was his first special education teacher because I was assigned as a very young new teacher to his school. I learned early on that handwriting was the least of Joe's problems. His social behavior was getting in the way. The kids were bullying him or isolating him. He would tattle on them, which was very much annoying to them. He would chew a lot of things. He would put a lot of things in his mouth, pencils, pieces of paper. The other children found that odd. He would go on in one-sided conversations on topics that the kids really didn't want to hear about. And I spent a lot of time that year saying, Joe, do this, and Joe, don't do that. But I was kind of that Charlie Brown teacher in their ear saying, wah, 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 because he didn't really listen to anything I said. It certainly didn't change his behavior. Well, I only taught in that school for 1 year, and then I moved across the country, but I did keep in touch with my aunt throughout the years because I loved John, and I was concerned about his schooling and his life and to know how things were going for him. Middle school was especially difficult. His teachers took an attitude that they would turn the other way when the peers were mistreating him, because if they gave him negative reinforcement through their bullying, then he would learn a lesson. Well, obviously that was a disaster, because no one was taking the time to teach him the lagging skills that he was missing. When he got to high school level, he really didn't want to go to school anymore. My aunt had a hard time even getting him to show up every single day to get in the car and go to school. There were a lot of stomach aches, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, and some depression. He went on to get a degree because academics were never the problem, but he really struggled to find a job in his career area. He did not ever learn those soft social skills of getting along with other people, making it through a job interview, knowing how to ask for questions, how to ask for help when you don't know what to do, all the social nuances of working in an environment with other people day by day. So, he grew up to live a quiet, isolated life. He really doesn't hang out with other people. He doesn't have very many interactions with others. He never found a job in his career field. And I think that it's kind of sad, because it is a loss for society that his incredible intellect and his quirky, wonderful, sweet personality is not manifesting itself and recognized and experienced by other people. So fast forward, we didn't know back then for Joe that he was on the autism spectrum. We didn't know then what we know now. But fast forward it to several years later, and I ended up teaching in Nebraska, and I had a student named Caleb, and Caleb had very similar social deficits as Joe, and I made my mind up that I was going to help him in a way that I wasn't able to help Joe. Caleb was having meltdowns every afternoon. By about 1 o'clock, he would be yelling, "I want it my way." The teacher would run out of the room with all the other students to keep them safe, and it just wasn't working very well. And out of desperation, I asked a 7th grade social studies teacher if I could come in her room, talk to the kids about autism, and she said, sure. And the kids were a very good audience. They asked good questions. And about 15 minutes after my presentation to them, Caleb came running in my room and he said incredulously, "They're talking to me." And that was the step 1 that kind of started to break down the wall and the barrier. After that, I chose a small group of kids, and it was all experimentation. I had really no model to follow, but I chose a smaller group of students to start a circle of friends with. And the information that I'm going to be sharing with you in this webinar is really the outgrowth of all of this experimentation, not only with me, but in other schools across our state. So we started to experience success with Caleb. The isolation and the bullying by peers stopped. The meltdowns decreased pretty quickly, actually. He became involved not only in the classroom, but he also became a sports manager. He was very interested in sports teams, and so he was a sports manager for basketball, track, and cross country. And that provided a whole lot of other social skill areas that we could work on. And, he was much happier, much more involved. His outcome was quite different than my cousin Joe's. As an adult, he grew up to be very much involved in his church, involved in Special Olympics, and he works a job and he lives on his own. So I was bound and determined that I wanted to share the story, the comparison between Joe and the outcomes for Caleb. Caleb received the social skills instruction for the lagging skills that he needed. My cousin did not, and the outcomes were quite different. So I got excited and I started to go around the state, and I would present about what was happening with our Circle of Friends group at workshops and conferences and school districts, really anybody that would have me. And during that time, I was approached by the director of the Autism Action Partnership, which is a nonprofit agency in Omaha, Nebraska. And she said to me that they wanted to support Circle of Friends. They wanted a school-based program. They thought that the motto was good, and they wanted to put their efforts into that. And so I'm very appreciative, and always will be, to the Autism Action Partnership for moving along the growth of Circle of Friends in our state. In 2011, as you can see from this chart, we started with an 8-school pilot program, high schools only. We went on the next year to have a little over 50 schools. We went to K-12. The next year, public and private school. There is one college, the University of Omaha, Nebraska, that also has support Circle of Friends groups as well. And you can see the progression of the growth in our state across the years. And you are the beneficiary of all of our experimentation across the state in this webinar. So one time when I was doing a presentation to a group of educators, I asked the question, what do your students on the autism spectrum need the most? And these are their responses. They talked about taking social skills, taking turns, conversation skills, making friends, sharing, appropriate behavior at recess, all those kinds of things. And then I asked them to think about that student again and to think about what their day looks like. How do they spend their day? And this is what came up. Now, I'm not saying that academics aren't important. They are. After all, we teach in schools, and that is our main mission. However, what was evident was that students on the autism spectrum were not receiving the level of social skills instructions that they needed. And Circle of Friends is a good way to do that. Some of the terminology we'll be using: Circle of Friends, it's an educational approach that facilitates the inclusion of children with disabilities in the school community by engaging the peer group. And those peers can support our students, their individual students with their special needs. Peer-mediated intervention is another term, and that is sort of the umbrella term over Circle of Friends. And the definition of that is an approach in special education where peers of the focused students are trained to provide needed tutoring. And that tutoring could be in educational academic areas, behavioral, or it could have to do with social concerns. Here's a visual where you can see how peer-mediated intervention is the umbrella term for several different ways of delivering these peer support groups. You may have heard terms like integrated play groups, peer buddies, group-oriented contingencies. There are models where paraprofessionals are trained to go into the classroom, and instead of being what I call a Velcro para stuck to one student, instead they work on training peers to support the student, and then they go around the room working with many different students and provide feedback to the peer support system, that kind of thing. There's also lunch bunch. That refers to a time of day where a school guidance counselor or teacher will meet with a group of kids and for the purpose of socialization and getting those students to know each other better and interact appropriately together. And then there's Circle of Friends, which will be our focus today. A little bit more terminology. The focus student refers to the student that the groups are for. These are kids who are isolated, alone, have poor social skills. They can have autism spectrum disorder or other disabilities. You may use the term peer partner or peer mentor. It means the same thing. Those are the students who are trained to support the focus student. And then facilitator, those are the adults that are implementing the groups. They can be special education teachers, paraprofessionals, speech pathologists, general education teachers, and even administrators. So why do Circle of Friends? It's not as if we don't have enough on our plate already as busy professionals, but we do want the best outcomes for our students that they can possibly have. For one thing, teachers lack time for intensive social skills immersion. I want my students to have 20 to 30 positive interactions per day at school. I'm good for maybe 2 or 3. I'm very, very busy, as I know that all of you are too. So I need to use those peers. They can either be part of the solution or they can be part of the problem. It fosters acceptance, empathy, and teamwork from peers. And I'll give you an example. So one of my students, I'll call him Danny, I really needed to do a lot of pre-teaching for PE class. That was an area that would cause him to have problems. He didn't maybe understand the instructions. He was overstimulated. He wasn't always successful. And then there would be meltdowns later in the day if he was not, didn't do a good job there. So one day I was planning on getting there, but other things came up. I didn't get out there in time to where the class was being held out in the football field. And by the time I got there, the teacher was already well into giving multi-step instructions, and I was just hoping that he was paying attention. I looked around, found him, and lo and behold, he wasn't looking at the teacher at all. He wasn't listening. He was pulling blades of grass, kind of in his own world. But because I had taken the time to put Circle of Friends in place, what I noticed was Hannah, one of our circle of friends peer mentors went over to him and said, Danny, we're doing a relay today. I'm going to run with you. I'm going to tell you when to jump, when to hop, when to pick up the frisbee and throw it to TJ. You just do what I tell you. So he was happy to have her help. He went through it successfully. The kids were high-fiving him and smiling at him. I don't know that he knew what he had done successfully, but he knew that they were happy with him, so he was happy. And because of that, because we had taken the time to put the circle of friends in place, the teacher was able to do what he was supposed to do, which is manage a large group of students. My day was saved. I didn't have to do a lot of cleanup for the rest of my afternoon due to any kind of a meltdown. And, he was happy learning skills, and the peers did a good job, and it's just as good for them too. It provides an environment to learn and practice social skills. Earlier in my career, I would do social skill role play and instruction in my resource room, and my students tended to do a pretty good job with a middle-aged lady. However, when they went out into hallways, the cafeteria, on the bus, the social world was closed off to them because of their behavior, and so they didn't really get the practice that they needed. Greater social contact opportunities equals greater feelings of connectedness. These kids can feel like they're part of that school body, and then you can avoid some of the anxiety and stress that can lead to kids not wanting to come to school. Peer communication equals better opportunities to troubleshoot. Because we have trained peers, I had a girl come to me and say, you need to talk to these two girls on the bus because they're telling Dalton to say these bad words, and he's laughing. He's thinking he's one of the kids and everyone's being his friend. He doesn't realize that they're really making fun of him. And so I said, great, I will talk to them. And so I was able to do some awareness with them and tell them, you may not understand, but Dalton has autism. Let's talk about autism. And, I'm not going to send you to the principal this time, but if it happens again, you go to the principal, you'll have to call your parents, and our resource officer is going to get involved. So either please stay away from him, or perhaps you'd like to engage him in a friendly manner. That's up to you. So as you can see, in the long run, implementing an intervention like this saves adults time. Let's take a quick look at the research base for a circle of friends. So the research tells us that there is an increase in children diagnosed with ASD, and there has been a related increase in inclusion. These kids are going to the regular school setting, classrooms, more and more. However, what they found is that social inclusion is not the same as physical inclusion. So sure, these kids are sitting next to their peers in a regular classroom setting for a lot of their school day, but if they don't get the social skill instruction that they need, they are not really socially included. School staff lack training and interventions for ASD, and academic competence is associated with social competence. And I found that this was an interesting study. They found that because some of our students on the spectrum are fairly competent academically, some of them are indeed gifted in some areas, school staff teachers felt that, they're good at math, they can write beautiful essays, they're in 6th grade, they should know how to behave by now. So that affected the way that they interacted with the students, and the peers pick up on that. So when staff don't have the training and the understanding, that can get in the way of their true social inclusion. Poor social competence plus school isolation by peers equals poor outcomes for youth with ASD. The kids who need the most social skill practice are getting the least due to this isolation. They also experience higher rates of victimization. Comprehensive planning for social competence development should incorporate peer training. However, few children receive this intervention. Other studies show that school social skill deficits contribute to anxiety and mood disorders, things like depression and stress levels going up, but few school programs target social skill development. The National Autism Center's National Standards Report, the folks there, they went in and researched a multitude of interventions for individuals on the autism spectrum, and what they wanted to do was to find out which interventions had an evidence base behind them so that people wouldn't waste their time doing things that weren't going to work. And what they found was that peer training equals established treatment with favorable outcomes. So the positive outcomes justify doing it. There's more good news in the research related to peer-mediated intervention. Researchers found that behavior is determined reciprocally, meaning that if classmates interact positively with students on the autism spectrum, there was a higher likelihood of them reciprocating that kind of social behavior. The research also found that peers who have received training and awareness on autism develop empathy for the student. It doesn't mean that the autism goes away, it doesn't, but they gain a greater understanding and are more willing to interact and work with those students in the classroom. Research showed that parents and facilitators experience satisfaction when their students and or children were participating in Circle of Friends groups. They found increased number of social skill interactions and improvement in social skill and improvement, development, and behavior. And there were some folks that also reported that these social interactions extended outside the school program. For example, one mother reported that the family went bowling, and at the bowling alley on another lane were some students from school, and a couple of them were in the Circle of Friends group, so they began to interact, and they were hanging out at the bowling alley together as well. So there's been reports of more invitations to birthday parties and other social outings outside the school setting. I have these research studies at the end of the webinar, and I'll share those slides with you at the end in case you want to delve deeper into them. But for now, we're going to move on to the how-to. These are implementation basics for building your Circle of Friends peer support group. We're going to cover how to choose focus students, how to decide on which group structure works best for you, how to choose peer mentors, and how to communicate with parents. We'll be covering those things in this first webinar. Knowing what to do at meetings will be the focus of part 2 in this webinar series. While there's room for individualizing the way that you run your Circle of Friends group, there are certain tenets that are non-negotiable if you want to have a strong group that really benefits your focus student. One thing that I recommend is that you meet weekly no matter what, in a minimum of 30 minutes. If you can grab more time, that's great. I've had some folks that tried to do maybe a 10 or 15 minute study hall period or morning meeting time, and that really is not enough time to really delve deep into the activities and the lessons and those other things that I'll be sharing with you. As far as when you meet, that's up to you. I know that there's not a lot of time in our busy days, but we have facilitators who meet with their groups during lunch. Some do before or after school. Some choose to do their Circle of Friends groups totally at recess. We'll talk about that. Some do it during study halls. It's really up to you when, but we do recommend once a week, no matter what, for a minimum of 30 minutes. We also recommend that there is an element of peer training involved. So if you're just getting together, you're playing in the gym each week or playing games or whatever it is, those social opportunities are very important, but you want to make sure that you're training peers to support that student too. These groups are goal-oriented with a teaching focus. So you're going to get together and you're going to do some fun things socially together. However, I will be helping you think about how to set goals for your group, how to set goals for the individual focus student, and how to set goals for the peer mentors. This is a teaching intervention. It's more than just getting together to have some fun, although it is fun and there is that. We will talk about a way to provide ongoing feedback so that the peers are talking to you and you know how things are going. And you want to run your groups with a philosophy that we all have differences and that we're more alike than we are different. We don't want it to be where the peers are, taken on so that they're going to fix that kid who's got all the problems. That really shouldn't be it. We all have differences and we want our kids to accept and embrace those differences. Other negotiable items include, besides the time of day that your groups meet, is the number of facilitators. Some people run their groups with one facilitator, some choose to do it with another person, maybe a couple of teachers or a teacher and a guidance counselor. That's up to you. Who is going to facilitate the group? You can use special education staff, gen ed teachers, paraprofessionals, or a mixture of those, or other specialists. Speech language pathologists are people that run a lot of these groups, and other folks too. The size of your group, we're going to be offering you different options for that. The type of awareness that you provide, whether or not you're going to do additional out-of-school activities, and whether you're going to choose to do any funding for your group. You don't have to, and we're going to get into all of these things in the next few minutes. You want to consider who your focus students are going to be. First thing, how many? What I get oftentimes when people are deciding to start up a Circle of Friends groups, they have a hard time because they say, I have 5 students who need these groups, or 6 or 10 or 15 of them. If it's your first time, you may want to start small with just one or two focus students, but that's up to you. We're going to talk about the different size groups in just a minute, but you want to think about that. You definitely want to consider students who have those social skill deficits and require that kind of instruction. You might consider having kids who serve a dual mentor-mentee role. And what I mean by that, I kind of discovered this when I had a reluctant student. He didn't want to come to Circle of Friends. He has autism and he wanted to avoid social interactions as much as possible because they caused him some anxiety. However, I knew it would be good for him to have the practice and I wanted him to go. So we included some students in our group who are also focused students who have Down syndrome. And so I went to the student with autism and I said, Jack really likes you a lot. He looks up to you, and we're going to start this group of kids getting together to have some fun, play some games, get to know each other better. And would you consider being a peer mentor for Jack? And while he didn't want to go if the group was for him, when he heard that it could be for somebody else, he was very readily available and wanted to come. And he developed some leadership goals, and he was, he had some pride for being able to help our student who had Down syndrome. So yes, the groups were definitely designed for him. He was definitely in need of social skills instruction, but I didn't tell him this group is for you. You can tell kids that, but I had a reluctant student. So what I found is that without meaning to in the beginning, some of my kids really do step up to the plate and they embrace helping other students as much as they're being helped as well. Next is time to consider choosing group structure. Do you want to use a small group model, a large group model, or a group within a group model? With a small groups model, facilitators choose 1 or 2 focus students and several peers, maybe 3, 4, or 5. They might meet at lunch once a week. Their meetings may take place entirely at recess. Recess provides a great social skill opportunity practice time. Some folks will pull kids at lunchtime to pre-teach whatever skill they're working on at recess, and then they'll kind of observe how that goes. They'll prepare the peers ahead of time to help teach those skills, and then they can practice the social skills alone with the focus student ahead of time before he or she interacts with peers. You can do role play, review, preview, video modeling, and use social stories to teach in a small group model. One of the benefits is that you really can laser focus on 1 or 2 focus students. The groups are a little easier to manage when they're small, and it's really good when you're starting out and just kind of getting used to running a group to start with a small group model. Currently, we're doing a large group model in my school. And by the way, neither a small or large group model has shown to have any better outcomes than the other. You need to choose a size group that's going to work best for you. But right now, currently, we're doing a 3-to-1 ratio with about approximately 30 peer mentors and 10 focus students. Because we do Circle of Friends from K-12, elementary, middle, and high school in our district, students are very aware of it. They belong to Circle of Friends at multiple different grade levels, and it's just a natural progression for them to continue on in the high school. So that tends to lead to larger groups. Because we're so well known and viewed in a positive light in our district, we also have parents many years who come up and ask us, I'd like to have my son or daughter be a peer mentor in the Circle of Friends group because that's something that they value and they want that experience for their child. So as a result, our groups tend to be big. If you're going to do a large group like this, you're going to need more than one facilitator. We have 2 special ed teachers and a paraprofessional that come to all of our meetings. Some schools choose to do a whole class option where the whole class is the Circle of Friends group. We have small schools in rural Nebraska where there may only be 10 or 11 students in a first grade classroom. So they'll do their group with the whole school, with the whole class. The advantages and disadvantages. With the advantages that you have a lot of students to choose from. When you have a large group, it's very likely that student's going to have a peer mentor in many of his or her classes, in lunch, there's kids to hang out with in the hallway, so they get to know more students. The disadvantage is that if you have a student who has a high stress level and anxiety, they don't like to be around large groups, that could be an obstacle for them. In that case, you can do a group within a group, which I'll be talking about on the next slide. Either way, whether it's a large or small group, you're going to build in a method for getting feedback from the peers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. This year, for the first time after doing a few years with a large group, we decided to go with a small group within a large group model because we had some kids who were very high anxiety and they were struggling in the large group. Some of our focus students are still doing well in that large group. So what we do is one of the 2 or 3 facilitators will take the large group of kids, so perhaps they'll go to the gym or maybe they'll do a craft activity or a service learning project, while I will take a small group of maybe 2 or 3, 4 or 5 students students to work on whatever social skill we're working on, such as could be a conversation skill, maybe it's playing a game together to develop other skills that are deficit areas for them. So that's how you do a group within a group. You will need more than one facilitator to do that. You can meet, we meet on the same day. We meet on Thursdays during our school-wide study hall. So for us, it's always the same time, but we'll split off into different places. And so the small group will provide targeted individual focus for the individual students' goals, while the large group will meet their goals in a different setting. So whether you do a small group, a large group, or a group within a group, you want to have a way to get feedback from peers. You want to know how things are going. For example, I had a student who would put things in his mouth and pick his nose a lot in, say, for example, math or science class. So we had trained the peers to give them a tissue or a piece of gum. We would provide those materials, those items for them so that they could give them to our focus student when they started to do that kind of behavior, and it served as a good reminder for them to please stop that. It's not socially appropriate. But I needed to know, once we came up with our plan and the kids had a few days to implement it, how was that going? So that's an example of something you would want to get feedback about. So you can have informal ways of getting feedback where kids just come up to you when they see you. I do lunch duty every day, so students tend to come up to me as I'm wiping tables, and if there's a problem, they'll come up and discuss that with me. I have one of my peer mentors in my co-taught Algebra 2 class, so we'll have quick conversations there. How are things going? You know, I involve some of my students in extracurricular activities, and so she is a peer support for them there. So, you know, we touch base in class. That would be more informal. Other facilitators have a formal peer-only meeting, perhaps once a month, where they share successes, what's going well with your interactions with a focus student. They'll share concerns, what's not working well, what do we still need to work on, and then they teach the peers how to respond and interact with the focus student. So, for example, if they've been taught a conversation model and they're going to go up to John and, you know, have a conversation, but John doesn't say anything back to them, or he looks away and doesn't engage them at all, we would maybe role play things that they could say to him. So that would be an example of teaching them how to provide support for the focus student. As far as choosing your peer mentors, you want to choose kids who are confident and not afraid of differences. Obviously, you want good social role models, but remember, you can include kids who are in special education programs as well as kids who aren't. Sometimes students who have ADHD or mild learning disabilities, they understand what it's like to struggle. They have big hearts, and they're very content to reach out and help support students on the autism spectrum. You want peers who want to participate. I will always start with a peer-only meeting to let them know that they're invited to be in Circle of Friends, and I outline what those expectations are. And I tell them, go think about it. Come on back next Thursday to our meeting if this is for you. And if it's not for you, maybe you're too busy, it's not your thing this year, don't worry about it. That's fine. Maybe in the future. You definitely want available peers. You can choose the top student in the class, the most social, kind, high achiever student, leader. However, if they're not in the same classes, or if they're too busy to ever interact in the world of that focus student, you might as well go on to somebody else. You want students who are not too busy, who are in the same classes, who have the same lunch period or in PE. Not all of those, obviously. That becomes very difficult in the middle and high school level as kids start to be in different classes. But you definitely want to choose peer mentors who are in some of the places that the focus student will be throughout the day. It's a bonus if you can find a few peers who have similar areas of interest. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not. But it's a big bonus if you find someone who plays the same video games. Maybe they both like chess, or, like to read, or, the same type of adventure books, or whatever it is. I always recommend being fluid with your mentor members, your peer mentors, and to go big. What that means is some of the peer mentors that you choose are going to fully embrace their role and interact with that social student, with the focus student, in a very positive way with a lot of frequency. Other students may do a little bit, and some might do it, not engage at all, and that's okay. If you've chosen some extra students, the ones that don't work out, you just stop, inviting them to meetings. They stop coming and they kind of fall by the wayside. So what I mean when I say go big is to be thinking all the time about who you can invite to your group. We'll invite peer mentors during the school year. At the semester, the classes change. I had a student, for example, who didn't want to go to strength and conditioning class, and I wondered why, because I knew he liked to work out. And he was coming to my room every day just saying, I don't want to go to class. Well, come to find out, he didn't know any of the students in that particular class. So I immediately chose one or two people to ask if they would be a support for him. I did some autism awareness for them, and they turned out to be a good support for him. So you can add members anytime you want. You can do whole class or multi-grade. I found that I had a girl, for example, who was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder in 8th grade. And up until then, she really didn't get much support. The peers didn't know anything about her other than she kind of annoyed them. So she had some very negative experiences and interactions with them for a long time. So when she got to high school, I chose sophomores, juniors, and seniors because they had no history with her and they were able to embrace her from the start. And you can also consider suggestions from the focus student. That helps them be engaged in the development of their group. It doesn't mean that all the students they choose are going to be their only peer mentors, but you can also ask them what they think. As I said, I want to make sure that my peer mentors understand what their role is. So I teach them in the beginning, if you choose to accept this invitation to be a peer support for a student with autism, I would like you to have conversations with them. I'd like you to speak with them daily if possible. If there's 5 peer mentors, that's 5 or 10 conversations. If there's 10 peer mentors, there's even more. And I teach them a conversation model that I'll share with you in part 2 of this webinar series, because it's not enough just to tell them to talk. You need to teach them how to do that. I often ask them to invite the focus student, to eat lunch with them at their lunch table. I tell them, I know that you have your friends and you have your friend group, and I'm not asking that it's every day. However, if there's 8 peer mentors and everybody invites him 1 or 2 days a week, he's always got somebody to eat lunch with. Sometimes I have to teach them to look for the focus student in the cafeteria and to call them over, because the lunchroom can be pretty chaotic for students on the spectrum. It's noisy, there's smells, sounds, all kinds of things going on. And so I tell them, you might need to say, hey, we're sitting at this table, come sit with us. So that's one of the things that I'll teach them to do. I have them sometimes support in extracurricular activities as appropriate. As I mentioned before, Caleb became involved as a student manager, and so I trained the other 2 student managers about autism and to be part of his peer support network as well. And I told them, gave them a clipboard with jobs that he would do. I talked to the coach and I taught them how to support him. I let them know that I want them to communicate with me how things are going. I tell them that the focus student is not going to get in trouble if they mess up. I expect that, and my job is to teach them, not to punish them. It's not tattling, it's telling to help them learn the lagging skills that they just don't have yet. And I have them tell them that they're going to be a cheerleader for the focus student to encourage them and help them feel good about coming to school. The last thing I want to share with you before we end part 1 of this webinar series is about notifying parents. Participation in Circle of Friends is voluntary. If you have chosen a focus student and their parent does not want them to participate, you really do have to honor that. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes in the early elementary grades, parents know their child is fantastic, and sure, they have some quirks, but they're this unique, amazingly gifted and talented individual. And so they don't want the other students to know that they have autism. They believe that, the other students will just recognize the inherent goodness in their child and will treat them well accordingly. Unfortunately, that's not always what happens. And sometimes parents who really don't want their classmates to know about it in kindergarten or first grade are begging you to do a group like this in 5th or 6th grade. But wherever the parents are on that journey, you want to respect it. If you're sharing a diagnosis, if you're going to share that, John or Sally has autism, you want to make sure you get parent permission. If the parents don't want it shared, you can still have them in a group. You don't have to tell them that they're a focus student. You can, tell them that they're part of the peer support network for everybody in the group. You can do awareness not only on autism, but you can do awareness on Down syndrome and Angelman syndrome and learning disabilities and ADHD and all other kinds of things, so that you're not sharing specifically with students that the group is for this focus student who happens to have autism. You can communicate with parents through phone calls, email, and paper form. I do all of the above, and so those are just some options for you. Before we end, I'm going to share just a couple slides with the research with you, just so that you know that the studies that I was talking about earlier, you can look those up if you're interested. These are by no means an exhaustive study on the benefits of peer-mediated intervention, but it's a good place to start. To give you just a minute to look through those. The research actually started, the earliest Circle of Friends groups in the literature that I read about started initially in preschool populations. It's relatively later that teenagers, adolescent populations have been studied. There is a need for more research in the field, but continuing and additional research studies are emerging. The National Standards Project report that I mentioned earlier, determining the outcomes of the evidence base for different interventions, is included in this slide here. And here's the final bit of that information that I shared earlier in the presentation. So this is going to end the first part of this webinar series. In the second part, we're going to get into exactly what to do at meetings. We're going to give you all kinds of ideas for meeting activities. We're going to share with you a virtual learning community that you're welcome to go to anytime to learn new ideas for implementing your groups and to get questions answered. And we'll be exploring possible obstacles for your groups, things that people have experienced, and ways to overcome them. We will also have a next steps document for you. It's a blueprint for developing your plan. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to sharing the second part of this webinar with you. Thank you so much.